we're going to have microphones shuttled around as you've got questions. You can ask a question from your seat. Just we'll use the conventional means of raising your hand. But if people in the audience can do that, but also I want to ask everybody to speak into the mics as best you can. So both for folks here up on the panel, the system is at its max volume, so we can't turn it up anymore. There's no 11 on this system; it just goes to 10. So if I can ask you all, Lynn and Maina and Diana, speak in the mics, and then also for our audience. So again, let me open it up. Questions from the audience. Just raise your hand and we'll move the mics around. Great. One here. Right behind you.
I'm a Vietnam veteran, and when I came back from Vietnam, I had a heck of a lot of questions, and I was doing a whole lot of reading about American foreign policy, and I was starting to understand how the interest of America seems to be to take over the world and the resources in the world. You can look at what we've done in Central America and now doing in parts of Africa, and the Middle East where all the oil is. And there's the most decorated officer in U.S. military history. His name is General Smedley Butler. Okay, he came to the conclusion after doing a whole lot of research when he got out of the Marines. Spent 33 years in the Marines. He researched who profited from the First World War and the Spanish-American War. And he found out that the big companies, the industries that were feeding the war were making 1,500%, 2,000% more profit during wartime. The incentive, and Eisenhower tried to warn the American people that the military-industrial complex has so much incentive to go to war now because it is so profitable. I'm just wondering if any of you, I think especially Mr. Wells, coming from a foreign policy background, what are your thoughts about how we, the people of this planet, really, can force those industries who have the incentive to go to war, force them to not have profit from war?
Okay.
So I think there are two things. Great question. So I think there are a couple of things. First of all, there's no doubt that there's still going to be large amounts of profits in fighter planes and ships and tanks and that sort of thing. And so one of the issues, actually, the government over the past couple of years has talked about 3 Ds, the diplomacy, defense, and development. And how do you balance them? And if you believe this, the business about phase 0 and stability and avoiding going to war, then clearly you want to be putting more money into development and diplomacy. It turns out that over the last 7 or 8 years, that has almost never made it through Congress. And one of the reasons is that you don't build very much development in the 13th district of State X, whereas any program manager worth their salt can absolutely show you by congressional district, how much money in this particular project is going to go into that district. So there's no doubt that these are very deeply entrenched thought processes and systems. What I would offer in answer to your question is 2 things. First of all, it's hard to define today exactly what is an American or a British or a French or a German company. I mean, most companies are pretty globalized. Even the Lockheed Martins and the Boeings and things like that. I mean, Boeing is getting more and more of its profits from China, GE. I mean, General Motors gets more profit overseas than it does in the U.S. And so there's clearly going to be some sort of a balancing effect over time about if you go to a war with country X, at some point it may really damage the profits of the company that heretofore, if it was Krupp or something like that, would only have been profiting from one country. I mean, honestly, everyone I talk to about China basically says there is no conceivable way that a war between the United States and China can make any kind of sense at all. Not only do they have all this debt of ours, but we're their market. And so we would just, they would lose their market, and we would. So there's more countervailing economics, I think, in here than there was in years past. Okay, will it be enough? I don't know. The other piece which we were discussing here on the panel is there's a wonderful picture on the cover of The Economist a few months ago of two women in burqas with cell phones. And you're basically getting the situation where every human being on the planet is a sensor. And the ability of governments to control information is just dramatically different than it's been before. Now, governments are getting very good at manipulating information. You can flood the internet with propaganda, you can threaten people who demonstrate, but the fact remains that the democratization of information is proceeding at a greater rate than we've ever seen before. So what's the balance of that between the globalization of the companies and the democratization of information? I'm not sure, but I'm almost certain that no society today would ever tolerate the sorts of slaughter of the first day on the Somme, or that we've seen in wars in the past, where you had 60,000 people killed in a day, or Cold Harbor during our Civil War. The internet, the availability of censors just wouldn't let you do it. So I think there are checks and balances sort of being imposed by the proliferation of information and the globalization of the economy that have yet to play out, but will begin to address some of the concerns you have.
Maina or Dan, do you want to?
Yes, I'd like to say something, and forgive me because I'm not an American, so I'm going to come at this from a different perspective. But I think for those of us who are not American, I think the big question when we look at American foreign policy and the way it conducts war and other things like that is how does it decide to go for what country? So, there are protests in Libya, and Gaddafi decides he's going to put them down, and the Americans with the Europeans and NATO start bombing campaigns that eventually lead to the death of the killing of Gaddafi and the new government, and from all indications actually a pretty progressive process is going on. But then you have Bahrain, and people go to protest, they're killed and mowed down and they're jailed, and the US is the first to say, we're not touching Bahrain. And you think, why not Bahrain, and why do you go to war and essentially use violence in Libya and not Bahrain? And these are, Middle East states, both of them. And then you recognize as well that actually the country that keeps the Bahrainian leaders and leadership intact is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And then you realize, aha. And when you look at what goes on in Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, there are very, very few countries in the world that are restrictive and as repressive as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It's up there with North Korea, it's up there with Cuba, it's up there with all of them. But you don't hear a word or a peep from the Americans. Now that begins to worry us, because how does foreign policy get made? And I suppose that for us is the big thing for those of us who are not Americans in terms of understanding that whole issue. And then you hear the same thing with a country like Ethiopia, closer home to where I'm from. And Ethiopia, it kills its dissidents, it jails people, it arrests them, it tortures them, and you'll never hear a peep from the Americans. And it seems to be because Ethiopia is now an indispensable ally to the United States in the war on terror. And these are things that don't help the United States internationally. So you find that the resentments continue against the U.S., sometimes of its own making. And what I think we all ask for, I think there's nobody who is naive about what goes on in the world. So we do understand the strategic interests, but at least clarify them and make it clear how you decide and have one standard. So if you're going to focus on strategic interests like China, then just do that and don't pretend to care about democracy and human rights. Just say, be like China, it's fine. We'll deal with you then in that context. We'll find a way to deal with it. So it's when America talks from both sides of its mouth as pro-democracy, as pro-peace, as pro-human rights, and then says, but you've got an interest on this other side about Saudi Arabia and oil and other things which will strategic. That becomes the hustle. But you don't hear people complaining about how they deal with China. China is very clear. China is coming for the minerals. It's coming for the oil. It's coming to tick. So you deal with it at that level. And as you can see, it's changing. I mean, nowadays, Chinese nationals are being kidnapped for ransom in Africa. They never thought they would be kidnapped. They thought, oh, those are Americans and British and French. They're being kidnapped, and this issue will be addressed in some form as well.
Danny, do you want to?
come back to the profit issue, because I think it is a real problem, and not only for American companies, but I agree with Lynn. They're global, they're profiting from our wars, but also profiting from other people's wars. And the two things that I sort of dig a little bit more into what Lynn has had to say. One is this whole move for transparency. Everybody says trace the money. Part of the reason that they're able to profit so much is that nobody knows what's going on. And so you're seeing a lot of pressure for people, for oil companies to show their profits so that people can actually start tracing where that money is coming from. Because once that gets revealed, then a number of these other mechanisms can kick into place. If it's hidden, it can just continue. One of the other mechanisms, I think both on just information and I'm thinking of the cell phones. I mean, these cell phones are now used to track where conflict is and where humanitarian disaster is. I mean, it's starting in Kenya with this Ushahidi network. So it's very difficult to hide now what's going on. You have people saying, okay, people are getting killed here, and they're texting it with their phone, and it's going, and somebody's collecting that information. So the capacity to actually collect information for people who are actually wanting to do something about it is also much, much bigger. So I think those who want to do something about it also have sort of tools available to them that are much stronger than they used to be.
I just mentioned one other thing, which is I mentioned earlier the Institute for Economics and Peace. And so while a lot of people have issues with their methodology for measuring peacefulness, they run the Global Peace Index, but they've done it now for about 8 years, and they're able to show, the numbers are crunched by the Economist Intelligence Unit, of the Economist magazine, so it's very credible in that sense, that there is a positive correlation between levels of peacefulness and growth in GDP and profitability. So we're beginning to eat away at the narrative that says, as Lynn and Maina and Diana said, that basically war is good for business. It's getting to be for a smaller and smaller set of people and more specific situations, but we really have to build on that. Again, questions from over here, yeah.
It seems to me that Maina had a really good point about the class system, and it seems that we've developed a class system, and it's not just in the United States, and it's not just in any one country, but there's a class of people, the ruling class, and the people who are in business, who do not see the flip side of our topic, which is the cost of war, and they see it in terms of money. So if you're a businessman, they're the ruling class right now. If you're a business person, you see it in terms of money. You don't see it in terms of the person who has lost their home, the person, the young girl who has been raped and put into prostitution. You don't see it in terms of the land that is now destroyed. And there's this whole class. So as long as they're making the decisions, what do we do? And so I would like you to address the cost of war.
Maina, do you want to start?
Oh, that's
you were looking at me like you didn't want to start, so I'm asking if you want to start.
The cost of war is I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think I'll start off with a little story. I had a conversation some years ago with Graça Machel of Mozambique, who is now the wife of Nelson Mandela, but she comes from a history of having taken part in the struggle for independence in Mozambique. Her first husband was the first president of Mozambique, Samora Machel. And so she's now retired. She's a pretty distinguished person within Africa and the world. She's a really global stateswoman. So she was telling us one time that she has no regrets for taking part in the struggle for liberation in Mozambique. She thought it was necessary to do so against the Portuguese to liberate the country, and they went to war. She said that she's got no regrets for doing that then. But then she recognized that one of the prices that they've had to pay as Mozambique is that violence has become a part of normal society. So when teenagers have a disagreement, they just take up a gun and shoot each other without thinking twice. They don't argue, they don't shout at each other, they don't use their fists anymore as we used to when we were younger. They now just take a gun and shoot each other. So there's a cost that sometimes is not seen in terms of the decay and the value systems in a society. And I think that some of the things that come out, and I think this country, and I hope if you forgive me if you allow me to comment about your country here, I mean, the history of this country is one that is militaristic. I mean, I like to say, this is a military society, and I think it's the only country, one of the few countries with the right to bear arms as a normal thing, and people fight to keep it and are desperate to keep it. But I think there's a consequence to that culture of violence that's there. And you can see the guns that are used very often. You can see how for many people, shooting somebody is normal. It's not so normal in other developed countries. This is, in a sense, there's a cost to it. And I'm avoiding the money part. I think that's obviously very high. But what it does to society and the value systems when you perpetuate and allow violence to go on and becomes a normal part of society is very, very high. And I think it's mental, it's intellectual, it's emotional. And I'm not sure how you can what ways you use to get out of it. And it's such a different thing to walk around in the streets of Scandinavia, and you actually even finding a policeman is very difficult. You'll walk and think, where are the police? And you hear, oh, they're around, don't worry, but you don't see them, let alone them going around armed, because there is a sense of calm. And yeah, okay, people say it's smaller and less, and historically it's a monolithic society in some ways. But I do think there's a cost that we pay when we allow or we perpetuate violence to go on as it is. And I think there's no country that gets as many killings in schools as we get in this country. I think, without having a war, sometimes the numbers of people who are killed in this country through firearms is probably as high as people killed in firearms in Somalia, in terms of, I know it's pretty high, so it's I don't have the numbers offhand, but it's pretty high. So it's something to ask ourselves whether this is what a society needs to come to grips with. So whatever we can, which is why you find a lot of us saying, let's try the non-violent approach, if difficult as it is, and sometimes as painful as non-violence is, and sometimes as frustrating as it gets. Sometimes you do think, but you understand that the longer term, it's better to get into a process and a system and a culture that's able to negotiate and argue and demand peacefully as opposed to violently. So I will leave the economic part of it, because I think I think that speaks for itself, as you might hear. But
Diana, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think at a systemic level, you need to have some rules and regulations that force companies to take into account these kinds of things into how they think about cost, because they respond to pressure. And that's why you see the UN developing, and the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation, and there are all these investors that are developing these kinds of social responsibility checklists. So say, all right, you can't do anything you want. You need to operate within and think about certain things. But I go down to when you actually look at a company going in, and it comes back to what you're saying. I think they're not thinking about it because they don't know how to think about it. They often also don't know how to think about it differently. They're under pressure from headquarters. There's a huge gap in communication. So some of these things escalate in ways, and some of these costs occur because they're not sure what to do differently. And that's a piece you can actually start to address, sort of at a local level as well. And I think you're finding is that people in a lot of individual circumstances, the more they start engaging with communities, a lot of the communities that they're engaged in are quite practical. They want to have jobs. They want a lot of what the company has to offer, and they also don't want the cost. And there often are options that they can actually figure out how to mitigate some of these costs within a larger framework where it says that the company needs to be responsible. But one of the things that makes these things escalate is that they assume that they have to resort to violence actually as a first resort. And so thinking about some processes that allow them to really engage in a much more nonviolent way, I think might go away, at least at local level, to dealing with some of these issues.
Lynn, did you want to comment?
So I think there's a series of costs that have been alluded to. There's a financial cost. And I mean, even if you add up the financial cost to the United States of, say, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I mean, you get numbers that vary quite widely from several hundred billion to some numbers of trillion. But that in the course of the economic activity that was generated during this period was relatively small. I mean, it's not enormous. And, compared with, say, the cost in the past, where World War I and II basically bankrupted Europe. And so it's a qualitatively different thing here. But then there's the entire history of human cost. I mean, so you say, okay, we've had whatever the number is, 7,000 or 8,000 people killed. But then you look at the number of Iraqis killed, and that number varies from some tens of thousands to some hundreds of thousands. The uncertainty is just enormous. And the problem is that each of our media, just because they're national-centric media, probably in Britain or Kenya or anywhere else, tends to discount the harm to other people far away. So if you actually had a way of aggregating the human cost of war, I think it would be, and illuminating it, I think it would be quite striking. I mean, here in the U.S., in addition to whatever numbers we have killed, we have people who are wounded who are going to be perpetuated in veterans' care for the rest of their lives. You add a burden that is yet to be determined over again, the cost of their lives. So one last point of this is we are entering something completely unknown for the U.S. military, and that is the consequence of the all-volunteer force is going to lead to a fairly small military that is more and more detached from society. And you can say, okay, well, after the Civil War, you had the people fighting in the West who were detached from society. Yeah, between World War I and II, they were detached from society. General Butler and the Marines were a fairly small unit now, but there were enormous pools of veterans who were in Congress, who were living in society, who could equate to that, relate to that. You're not going to have that now. I mean, the number of veterans in Congress is diminishing yearly, and so what you're going to have is a very highly trained, professional, extremely expensive military that's going to be increasingly detached from the American people. And so the question of how the people choose to use it and how the people choose to evaluate the costs of that is an area the country has not really ever been asked to look at. And I guess it comes back to the point that we've made all along. There's something to be said for transparency. And that's one thing that we now have better than we've ever had before, is the ability to at least see and know as a society what some of these things might be costing actually, as opposed to what the merchants of death or the whatever would like us to think. And then the question is, do we want to listen? I mean, that's one of the real problems I have, is there all the complex issues we have out there, the amount that gets teed up for us through the normal media channels is just a minuscule part of the really tough questions that are out there. So how can we demand that information be made available and we act on it?
I know we've got some groups of high school students here, and I want to make sure we give you guys, you may be reluctant to raise your hands. I see one. There we go. That was my call for a hand.
So, how do countries move from a state of calm to peace? How do we create peace among people while there are so many ongoing inequalities? And is it truly possible for everyone to benefit from the same security and prosperity in the world?
Maina, that one's yours. I was just saying...
Yes, no, yes, no.
The hardest questions are always asked by high school students. And see, I'm proven to be right.
Great, so you get to go first.
So I get to go first. Yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure we know how to do it yet. In that sense, I mean, it's a messy process, and I think one of it is that we need to stay committed. I mean, what frequently happens, and I'd say from an international perspective, the United States can't make peace in Afghanistan or Iraq or Kenya, but we can, like any other international sort of support, accompany, help, encourage. And what tends to happen is things get to be at a stable point, and then everybody has very short attention span, and we say, okay, it's fine. And so things can go back to normal. So in that sense, I think even just lengthening our time frames, investing in some of these processes for a longer period of time, and coming back to the transparency and saying, what's actually going on? Are we actually making progress? Are we not making progress? Are we stuck? Are we going backwards? Even that is helpful. Now, the question about will all countries get treated equally, et cetera, I mean, I think it's a tough it's a tough one. But we have tended to think and go to the news. You tend to think well, you hear the news, well, they haven't made peace in Israel and Palestine yet at the latest round of talks. We are going in 3-month or 1-year or 2-year. Projects are in maybe 3 to 5 year, if they're really good interval. That's not long enough to do very much. So some of it is really thinking much more long term and thinking about how to strategize on that. I wish I had a better answer for you.
Also, just a commercial that you're probably not wanting to give, but so Diana's organization, the Collaborative for Development Action, if you go to their website, they've done studies on things like cumulative impacts in conflict zones. And so there's been a lot of people are trying really hard to answer your question. I agree with Diana, we haven't quite answered it yet, but Maina has.
No, I don't think I'm going to answer. I'm going to try just to help a little bit. I think moving from calm to peace, in my view, needs a number of things, and one of them is a real serious effort at addressing some of the long-standing issues that divide societies, and each society, and this is different from country to country because the issues that divide society are different from country to country. So in the context of Kenya, I think for me it's really the question of inclusion and exclusion, dealing with the question of ethnic differences, dealing with impunity and accountability, and making sure that those who are powerful can actually be held to account when they commit crimes. And I think that's a big one for us. As you know, as you may know, the president of Kenya today has been charged and is indicted by the International Criminal Court. I think is the only president in the whole world who's supposed to face international justice. So how do you then get peace? I suppose you've got to deal with that issue of that case and have him face justice in a real court and see what happens. I think that's how we've won one way. So it's a lot of things that you need to do. But I think it's a sense, for me, it's giving sense of hope to society and those who are excluded that their issues will be addressed. They won't be addressed overnight, but at least give a sense of hope that yes, we care and we can be able to address those issues. On the other question about security for the whole world, one of the things that we always say as in Africa is that it takes a significant number of deaths before the international community understands that there's some conflict going on in Africa. And even now there's been so many deaths in Congo and killings in Congo, but it doesn't appear in the news anymore because it's supposed to be normal. So there's a real sense of differences, and I think we saw that as well, particularly around the around the 90s when Rwanda had the genocide happened in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia issues were happening, and it was amazing reading some of the facts about how the United Nations itself dealt with refugees from both countries. So the ration available for a refugee from former Yugoslavia was something on a daily basis was, I think, something like about $6 or $7 a day, just to make sure they're fed and taken care of. For the Rwandese refugees, it was less than $1 a day. And these are same human beings all having the same needs. So when you have that kind of a system which distinguishes between where somebody comes from, and you ask them, they said, well, Africans eat less than Europeans, so we'll give them less food. They don't eat spaghetti, they eat cornmeal every day. So there are all these kinds of answers given. So yes, I think there needs to be something done to ensure that there is a sense that every life is as important as the other, wherever it is, which is why we care. And a lot of us, get very worried when we hear about the shootings in high schools here and in elementary schools and in universities. It is of worry to us because it's innocent people being killed, and that's what you don't want to hear. So whether they're in Somalia or they're in Ohio or in Virginia or in Russia, it's of importance because every life should count for something, before people die.
So one of the questions for you in your future is how much of this problem do you want to take on? I mean, he's absolutely true. I mean, the amount of attention we pay to the horrific things that are going on in Eastern Congo and Africa are very differential to what happens in Newtown or Boston or things here at home. And so these are, in the universal human condition, this ought to be weighed as an equal value. People are people. but we get focused on our own worlds. You all have a future to decide to say, I want to make my horizon broader than just Wisconsin or just the United States, but I want to really address these questions. Tough questions, because it will lead you to difficult issues. There's another question, I think, about timelines, and this was alluded to earlier, but Zhou Enlai, who was former number 2 to Mao Zedong in Communist China, when President Nixon went to China in '73, there's a story that he asked Zhou Enlai, what do you think about the French Revolution? And Zhou Enlai's reporter said, too soon to tell. But there's some very interesting data that show that in 1500s or so, 75% of the world's gross domestic product was in India and China. And so what we've seen over the past century or so was actually an aberration from what the historical trends have been about the distribution of wealth around the world. And so a lot of the economic imbalance we see, and your question about how do people benefit, is to some extent the rebalancing of some imbalances. And someone once told me the most strategic factor of the 21st century is going to be the emergence of 2 billion middle class in Asia, in terms of the impact on resources, in terms of the impact on the global economy, in terms of the impact of people flows and things like that. So when you ask the question, can you get, I forgot exactly how you phrased it, but basically can peace be distributed equally, can wealth, happiness be distributed equally? I mean, this is one of the great debates going on in this country right now. You have equality of opportunity, or do you want equality of result? Equality of opportunity will lead you almost certainly to maximum inequality of result. Some number of people will succeed spectacularly. A vast number of people will be in the pre-labor union sweatshops. If you choose to distort that market and say, I want equality of result, then how much are you willing to intervene as a government to prevent excesses? And so you're never going to cross the goal line and spike the ball on this one. It's going to be a continuing dynamic of ebbs and flows, of who's in and who's out and what philosophy. But I think your questions are just the core of everything that we should be looking at. I just don't have a nice, easy answer tie up with a bow for you.
Maybe on this side? Yeah.
These are smart.
Growing up, I was fortunate enough to take in multiple viewpoints of 21st century conflict and see places that aren't exactly like the United States. And I've seen in other countries that a common nature is where people strive to live like Americans, and not exactly, and not specifically towards economic prosperity, but also towards just the way of life that we have. And another factor that people have taken into consideration is how civilians in rural areas exposed to conflict are faced with tough decisions when they're deprived of human necessity. And they often face choices where there are radical groups that attempt to offer them safety or security in exchange for them to conform to their nature. And so there's also this idea of minority cultures being up against the wall, sort of, in a sort of way. And people almost act like animals in a corner with nowhere else to go and act irrationally in dire situations like this. And on top of that, there are also American businesses with strongholds in marketing techniques that promote the lifestyle we have. So basically my question is, how much of American influence on global culture affects the level of peace?
16.4%.
Yeah. Just a little. I mean, I think I like what you're saying, because one of the things that has always struck me is even the U.S. as the global power is, its willingness to use its hard power as opposed to its soft power. I think one of the clear things that you see everywhere in the world is American cultural influences in terms of the way young people especially talk and the way they dress, the way what they want to eat and what they want to drink, and the whole power of the American corporate brand, if you wish, has been quite powerful. But and the reluctance to use that soft power. I mean, I think one of the strongest things that America used to do, and has reduced it now to a large extent, was the bringing people into the United States just to see how it goes and come to universities here. And you can be a critic of the United States, but if you get a quality education at MIT, you'll always have a soft spot for the United States of America. You always will. And you don't see people from Venezuela going to study in China. They come to America. You find the Chinese are coming here, the Indians are coming here. So there's a lot of strength in that soft power that could be harnessed, in a sense, if it's value-driven, as opposed to being power-driven. And this is the, I think for many of us, the difficulty we have with America is that America has a very nice selling, a very nice marketing ploy of values, which is really attractive. When the Americans talk about the Declaration of Independence, the War of Independence, the Civil Rights struggle, it's a really nice, attractive narrative. But there's another hard side of America, which comes in and takes and beats up and bullies and does other things. So in a sense, America can be a real, true global champion of peace if it wanted to, using its soft power, or some people like calling it smart power now. But that's part of the dynamic. But it can be a champion of peace if it wanted to. But I think it's something that you have to go through, because this is a question for yourselves rather than for those of us outside. How you want to be seen, how you're dealing with your own dynamics of the gap between the rich and the poor, how you're dealing with businesses within the United States itself. Because if you have these businesses that are completely unregulated and giving all these bonuses, it doesn't look good at all that you have people who will make a loss and take $500 million as bonus, whatever it is they're getting. Those seem very, very weird for a country that built itself as a democracy and moving away from the class system of Europe, and then comes and does that. So there's the challenges, I think, for you all here to handle and deal with. But I think one of the attractive things of America is the consistent refashioning of itself that it does. And so with the way it dealt with after the slave trade and slavery and then Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement, there's always that element that gives people, those of us who should look at America from outside and think, maybe there's something to learn here. So, but there are challenges, and I think you've got to get over. You've got to get over these assault weapons first of all. You've just got to drop them. You've got to drop them.
Lynn, did you want to chime in?
So supposedly when President Clinton first met with the then president of China, so this is 93, 4, something like that, he said, we need to find a way to help China develop differently, because there's no way that the planet can survive if China picks the same development path the United States does. The same path of resource intensiveness, the same path of pollution, so on and so forth. So, I mean, the soft power, which is in some respects a reflection of economic power, some which a reflection of people wanting what they see us have, I'm not sure is sustainable across the planet. So how do we change that? And so I'm not sure. I mean, you're the people who are going to change it. I remember 1966, 67, 68, by God, times there are changing, the loser now, later to win, so on and so forth. Well, we haven't done a real good job of it. So how are you going to do a better job in your lives? But I think these are really, it's a really core question about what's the moderation of the success that this country has had in a way that more and more people across the planet can achieve the kind of balance of equities and balance of goodness that they certainly want and perhaps deserve. And I think it's one of the core questions we have going forward. I don't have an answer. But I think, again, the transparency of people being able to see we just can't keep doing things this way, somehow we ought to change it, will go a longer way than any policy pronouncement that people make.
The only thing I'd add is that we have huge impact by sort of the implicit messages we send by how we behave. And just coming back, if we're not able to actually figure out how to make those difficult decisions, I mean, because all of these involve some powerful people will lose some, and society as a whole will gain, and you need to figure out how to manage and negotiate that. And the more we can do that, the better model we are, and the more influential we are when we go to other places and say, we're asking you to do the same thing. So there is a connection in that sense, I think, as well.
Great. Let's take a couple more questions. Yeah, right here.
In light of what Maina said earlier, what can and should the United States do to demonstrate that we are not at war with Islam and Muslim people?
Sure. I think he might have singled you out on that one.
What should the United States do? I think it's got to treat people better than it has, and it's got to first of all deal with Guantanamo Bay in a real sense, which is holding Muslims, and it's a unique prison which is outside the scope of anything. People have no rights in there, and that doesn't help in terms of how the United States is perceived. So as long as Guantanamo Bay exists and is not closed, and it's outside the wonderful structures of law and justice that exist in the United States, that is going to be an issue. I think the other question has got to be addressed is how it deals with the Middle Eastern crisis and issues between the Palestinians and Israelis in a large way. Is it even-handed? Is it not even-handed? Is it seen as supporting one against the other? And I think for those of us now within our location in the Horn of Africa is the questions of how it deals with Somalia and Somali people, and and I think that's some of the things that have to happen. If you think again now, the last obvious wars the U.S. has been engaged in have been in Muslim countries. It's Afghanistan, it's Iraq, it's Libya, and I suppose there are issues around Iran. I don't think the U.S. is going to go to war with Iran at any point. But there's the way it deals with Saudi Arabia and the repression within the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So I suppose there are those kinds of things that might help. And the profiling that we have in this country against people who are seen as Islamic. And I don't know, I've got a friend of mine who's a distinguished professor in Sunni, Professor Ali Mazrui, who's almost 80 years old, and he talks about how just a couple of years ago he had to go be strip searched in Florida. He's an old man. I mean, he's frail, and they strip searched him, and he's been in this country for years and years and years. But because he bears a Muslim name and his name is Ali Mazrui, they strip searched him. So all those stories don't quite help.
We're running short on time, so I'm wondering, there's several hands. If we can get maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then I'll ask you all to respond to the questions that you want. So let's try that. Myrtle up here, then let's go back there, and then maybe the two hands back in the back.
The title puzzles me because it says, "Does peace pay?" And this hasn't really been addressed. On the other hand, we know that war pays handsomely, and a good example of that was in the paper just this week. A massive arms deal, the U.S. and Israel, our best customer. Our tax money goes to Israel as a grant to enable them to buy our military production, which is a rather roundabout way of subsidizing the military-industrial complex. Now, peacefully, we could be using that money for our infrastructure and many other peaceful purposes. But it is highly more profitable to the United States military-industrial complex to keep those wars going. And I would like to ask why this title, "Does Peace Pay?" when nobody has any answer in the affirmative to that.
Okay, so questions there are 2 hands in the back.
We've talked a lot about the role of government and nonprofits and people in the private sector. I was wondering if we could just talk a little bit more about the role of individual citizens, those of us sitting here, community members, high school students, and what role we can play in the peace process.
Great.
This is a question for Dr. Wells. Could you comment on the changing role of the CIA in all of this? You commented on the defense at large. I'm curious, any thoughts on the CIA?
And was there a question over here on the yeah?
My concern as a teenager is peace is really an option unless we have clean, renewable, ubiquitous energy sources.
Great. So let me, maybe perhaps if we, I may come the opposite direction. Diana, if we can start with you, then Maina, then Lynn.
All right, well, I'll start with the does peace pay? I mean, I'm with you on that. There are many of us who would like to see the defense budget reduced. But I think we can be with there's some parts where conflict pays and some parts where peace pays, and I would be reluctant at least to sort of put everybody into the military-industrial complex and lose opportunities to actually bring some of the folks and to get more responsible companies to be doing better things and improving conditions in places where there is conflict and where people are suffering. I think there are lots of different ways to deal with that. So for some businesses, I think they're finding that peace is paying for them. But there are clearly going to be some that we need to then think about. How do you change the cost-benefit calculation? And I think individuals, one of the things in my own research, as we looked at sort of how things add up and what effective peace practice is, it's pretty clear that peace can't be made from the top down. All the places that have tried to do things and have negotiations at the top level, at some point either fail to deal with some of the deep issues, or if people aren't involved and owning the peace process and doing things, whether it's in their own communities or sort of in an advocacy or in other ways, it makes it very difficult. So I think there's a whole lot of space for individuals not as part of NGOs, and I can talk about, there are lots of NGOs are part of the peace industry. Individuals may not be. So there are lots of things in terms of even just within their own community that one can do just to stay informed, to inform people, to be actively involved on foreign policy issues with your own senators, congresspeople. So there are so many different things. Okay, I think the question is sort of choosing which direction you'd want to do. But that engagement sort of between the sort of elite level and individuals, I think, is really important to move the process forward.
Maina, do you want to pick up on some of these questions?
Yeah, just again, I think for me, when you ask whether does peace pay, I think for me the answer is that is beyond finances, is beyond the economics. And I think there's the emotional and intellectual stability and other things that we get when we have peace and be able to do other things. I think addressing the question that the young lady, the high school student asked about energy and renewable sources, is really does the fact that is that once there's a real just peace, then you're able to deal with environmental issues and you're able to deal with energy and other things that are there in a comprehensive manner. So for me, it's a broader, much broader issue than just financial payments. And I think that when I look at peace and the whole concept of peace that I have, it is human security as well. It's what we as human, not just physical security, it's a human security we get. So I look at it much, much more broadly in that sense. And I think that's where I see that link for the future for the high school students in terms of where they're going is how do you make sure that human beings are the center of everything? And you're talking about the human being. Do they have the ability to walk in the streets at night? Do they have the ability to go to school and get a good quality health care? Do they have the ability to have an environment that is good and good water and clean water and everything else that we have got right across the world? That's the way I see it as, and be able to debate and have intellectual development as well. So that's how I see it in terms of it. So it's not for me just a monetary thing, because I think that's been understood, and I think we were told about The Economist and the studies they've been doing in terms of understanding the economic part of it. So that's where it's at. And individuals, I think for me are it. I think I take a very personal view of this work that I do, and I think all of us need to live it in our homes, in our workplaces, and it's one of the dynamics we have. How do you live your life? And I think because once you live your life in a manner that makes sense, it does touch other people and influences other people. So if you're not, I grew up in a society and at an age where we were beaten as kids by our parents, and it was a part of life, and I'm sure the older generation here understands it. And so we were not averse to violence ourselves because we've grown up with violence. But once our generation now is not beating up on kids, and that's beginning hopefully to send and you'll find if you look at people who are violent, wherever it is, and those who are then prone to going to, and I'm taking that from a very micro perspective, but if you go to a macro perspective, there is almost always an element of violence they've had in their home and in their growing up, and trauma leads to some of these behaviors that are there. So I think there's a place where there's a real role for individuals in very many ways.
On the peace pay, I don't disagree with anything that's been said. On the Israel, I mean, again, this is, remember the large measure of the initial military aid to Israel came as part of the Camp David Accords. And so it was a trade-off between aid to Israel and Egypt in order to get a peace treaty between the two of them. Now, where's the trade? Yeah, you have companies making profits. On the other hand, you've not had a war between Israel and Egypt since 1973. Is that a valid trade? I'm not sure, but it's not quite as clear-cut as just we're selling, giving them money to buy airplanes. And the role of citizens, some years ago I was in Istanbul, and listening to BBC and Deutsche Welle and CNN, it was obvious only three things happened. Michael Jackson had died. This for a week. There was some grainy video from some place claiming to be an Iranian protest, and there were a bunch of sports events. And so the question was, how can we possibly make the decisions on the types of issues we're being asked to decide when that's the level of information we're getting? Okay, fine, so you have the internet. You have the resources of the whole world on the internet. But one of the problems we're having with our RSS feeds and our blog subscriptions and everything is we tend to focus on people on information flows that reinforce the views we already have. Instead of being able to get the totality of differing views, we just reinforce it. So I was with someone who was a journalist and covering Israel and Palestine. She actually was covering both. And she said for her journalists, she required every day that you listen to someone with whom you viscerally disagreed. Okay? So if you're a PBS person, go listen to Rush Limbaugh every morning, and vice versa. I mean, but you've got to find some way to diversify, and that's one of the things I think the people can do is make sure that we're informed. How can we have a democratic society making decisions on these issues when we as a people are not informed about the issues ourselves? With the CIA question, let me take that offline and talk to you afterwards, because there are a lot of things there I want to talk about. And energy, I just absolutely agree with you. The point of energy, though, is in 1983, I guess, I was attending a college in Japan, and I was supposed to do a presentation on energy. And so we took the absolute best projection that the U.S. Department of Energy had issued like 6 months before, and it had a best estimate and a worst estimate. And between February and November, the estimate was already outside, the actual numbers were outside of this range that had been issued by the best experts in the world 6 months before. And I concluded at that point, nobody has a clue as to really what's going on in the long-term energy picture. The point being, and I saw something this morning that talked about forecasts of renewable energy in the world economy by 2050. And it ranged from 11 to 82%. But I think what's happening is that there's actually, and my own personal belief is it's going to come faster than most people think of. As the photovoltaic costs go down, there's more electrical vehicles. You got to build the grid to handle it, the policy issues. We can talk for all night on that. I don't disagree with you. We got to find a way around the energy picture. I think there may be some hopeful signs there. Sorry.
So I know everybody hasn't had their say and would like to talk more, and we may have some opportunity for doing that offline. You can have your say. We have a comment form, looks like this, that was in the program. So if you can fill these out. Also talks about ways to stay connected with the Institute and the kinds of programs that we do. that would be greatly appreciated. Of course, I mentioned our Facebook and YouTube presence, which you can also look at. I want to just end by recognizing some people who really made this possible. First, the Institute staff, so Nicole Pallas and Dina Wolf, Rachel Schrag, without whom we couldn't do this. I also want to recognize a person who helps to orchestrate the madness that we do. That's the Vice Provost for International Education, also the Director of the Center for International Education, Patrice Petro, who's here with us tonight, who makes all this possible. And there are two people without whom we couldn't be doing a Kennan forum. One is George F. Kennan, goes without saying. The other is Carol Bauman, who's here in the audience. And Carol, this was her brainchild and helped to make it a reality and brought George Kennan to be the first speaker of the Kennan Forum back in 1990. So also a big thank you to Carol as well. And lastly, the three most impactful people for the last couple hours, so Linton Wells, Maina Kiai, and Diana Chigas. Please thank them for a great panel. And thank you all. Thanks for coming.